So we've already talked about the new Rand report that shows that the top 1% of Americans have taken $50 trillion from the bottom 90% of Americans. What seems to be at issue is what we should do about it. As you know, I, and probably you, have had some trouble with our comfy Democrats. The people on our Facebook feeds and Instagram and Twitter feeds. They say things like, I love Bernie, but Trump. We have to get rid of Trump. He's the most dangerous president in U.S. history. He's the most dangerous leader in world history. He's worse than Hitler. And again, we see that people are just getting their news from corporate sources. And that's why they believe the narrative management about Trump. And that's why they don't blame neoliberalism. They think all of our problems are caused by one person who just showed up a few years ago, rather than blaming it on every politician that we've ever had since Ronald Reagan till now. The corporate narrative managers don't want comfy Democrats to blame both parties for everything that's happened in the last 40 plus years. They want us to blame everything on der Trumpfer. I've even faced this problem in the comments of my YouTube channel here. Especially problematic is when we excuse high-level, big-name leftists when they tell us it's okay to vote for Biden in the face of the horrors we're facing under another 4 years of Trump. A lot of high-level progressives have been telling us it's okay to vote for Biden. And a lot of people who say they love Bernie Sanders are just duped cronies of these assholes. We have to stop letting them off the hook. Cornel West, Noam Chomsky, Norman Solomon, David Dole, all of these people who tell us, Cenk Uygur, they tell us to vote for Biden, or they tell us they're voting for Biden and we can do whatever we think best. This is bullshit. These are not leftists. You can't vote for corporatists. You can't vote for the deep state, the permanent state that Kamala and Joe are both hip deep in, and be a leftist. And whether or not voting matters, your endorsement of neoliberalism matters. We can't protest in the streets. We can't do general strikes and wildcat strikes while at the same time endorsing the assholes who gave us the problems in the first place. George Carlin is right. It's better not to vote than to put your stamp of approval on these assholes. We're not going to push them to the left. The only way to push them, other than with dollars, is protesting and striking. And as some of our more radical leftists have been saying, property damage is part of the equation. Property damage is why we have the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Property damage makes our owners very nervous, and without the property damage that happened in the riots of 1968 and before, we wouldn't have the Civil Rights Act right now. This is what I said on my Facebook feed this morning. Feel free to share this if you go to my Facebook page. Biden's current position on any issue always has and always will be whatever his masters tell him. Kamala, too, is hip deep in the mire that the permanent state has for 40 years imposed on the world. U.S. imperialism, mass incarceration, climate disaster, economic injustice for the bottom 90%, and all of the other austere fruits of neoliberalism. Der Trumpfer is an incompetent bungler, and moreover is largely an invention of corporate narrative managers. The neoliberal permanent state that arose with McCarthyism is what must be opposed. An unwavering belief that we must vote against Trump, the most dangerous president in history, is proof that corporate narrative management is your only source of information and that you have swallowed their agenda-driven news hook, line, and sinker. In short, if you believe what corporate-owned media are saying, you are a dupe. We were talking about Ralph Nader in the comments from yesterday's show. And I said, if Ralph is attempting to manipulate the masses in a way that allows them to vote for Biden in good conscience, he is marching to the orders of our neoliberal masters. Telling people not to vote for Biden and the cabal that pulls Biden's and Kamala's puppet strings is apparently a bridge too far. None of the big-name leftists seem able to utter the words, never Biden or Bernie or bust, without being spanked. Look at Susan Sarandon as an example. And if they are afraid of the censure of the ruling class and their tools, they are not worthy to be called leftists. Reply was, I wouldn't call it an attempt to manipulate. I think he's just passionate about politics and humanism because, he's Ralph Nader, and as such feels compelled to share his opinion and speak to as many people as possible while doing it. That's called pandering. I don't think many leftists who feel like voting lesser evil is best for this election and who are trying to convince others of the same feel great about it. Lol. If you don't feel great about it, don't do it. If you're on a diet and you see that donut, don't fucking eat it. Don't just feel bad about eating it. What good does that do? And neoliberal politicians and pundits are not donuts. They're much worse for you than donuts. My reply was, for me, #never corporatist is an unbreakable vow. It's absolutely non-negotiable. Comfy complacency is why we have neoliberalism. The high-level leftists who refuse to insist on this are a bane to the world's progress. And the regular people who allow this to slide are unwitting dupes and cronies of the elites. This is probably why I don't have thousands and thousands of followers on my YouTube page. Most of the hardest hit victims of neoliberalism are probably not following any political YouTube pages. The political system has abandoned them for many years. There's no reason to believe, if you're one of the hardest hit victims of neoliberalism, that a political solution is ever going to work. If we are dialed in to what's going on in the political world, we have to make sure that we're connected to everyone in society, to every kind of person in society. Otherwise, we're just in our own affluent, educated echo chamber, and it's not going to help anything. Canvassing is good because it gets us out into the neighborhoods, but protesting is even better because the people who protest are probably the hardest hit victims, and rubbing shoulders with them is what gets the word out fastest. What we really need is for PewDiePie to get this word out there. We need PewDiePie to subscribe to my channel and then feature my channel on his channel and tell everyone that this is the news they need to be consuming. But I readily admit that I'm not as engaging as PewDiePie, not even close. So if PewDiePie wants to come on my show and engage people, he's more than welcome. You hear that? Anytime you want to come on my show, PewDiePie, you are absolutely welcome. The fate of the world's workers rests in your hands. So let's get to this article by Nick Hanauer and David M. Rolfe. Hanauer is an entrepreneur who tells us to beware of the pitchforks. He tells his fellow venture capitalists to beware of the pitchforks. He's also the founder of the public policy incubator Civic Ventures and the host of the podcast Pitchfork Economics. Rolfe is founder and president emeritus of SEIU 775, so he's a union guy, and the author of The Fight for 15. The top 1% of Americans have taken $50 trillion from the bottom 90%, and that's made the U.S. less secure. And hopefully it's pissed off the bottom 90% to the point where they're ready to do something about it. Before I launch into the article, let me tell you that Kyle Kulinski yesterday or the day before was saying, after he mentioned this article, that we should have a general strike. And I thought that was pretty good. Kyle, you said we need a general strike. He hasn't yet said we need protests with copious property damage, but he's on the right track. We do need a general strike. Kyle seems to be coming around to the idea that we need to fight back in other ways than trying to vote our way out of the problems we face. Instead of giving the DNC advice as to how best to win us over, he now seems to think that we should force the issue. And he's right. Like many of the virus's hardest hit victims, the United States went into the COVID-19 pandemic racked by pre-existing conditions. A fraying public health infrastructure, inadequate medical supplies, an employer-based health insurance system perversely unsuited to the moment, these and other afflictions are surely contributing to the death toll. But in addressing the causes and consequences of this pandemic and its cruelly uneven impact, the elephant in the room is extreme income inequality. How big is this elephant? A staggering $50 trillion. That is how much the upward redistribution of income has cost American workers over the past several decades. And because I've already given you the specifics of the Rand report, I'm going to skip that part and go on to the conclusions. You can go back and watch that episode if you missed it. I will add, though, that Nick Hanauer has tried to get the entrepreneurs involved in this problem because he believes that if the American economy grows radically unequally, it will hold back economic growth, and those same entrepreneurs will be harmed, as well as all of the people lower down the socioeconomic ladder. One of their conclusions is that even inequality is meted out unequally. Low-wage workers and their families, disproportionately people of color, suffer from far higher rates of asthma, hypertension, diabetes, and other COVID-19 comorbidities, yet they are also far less likely to have health insurance and far more likely to work in essential industries with the highest rates of coronavirus exposure and transmission. It is no surprise then, according to the CDC, that COVID-19 inflicts a disproportionate burden of illness and death among racial and ethnic minority groups. But imagine how much safer, healthier, and empowered all American workers might be if that $50 trillion had been paid out in wages instead of being funneled into corporate profits and the offshore accounts of the super rich. Imagine how much richer and more resilient the American people would be. Imagine how many more lives would have been saved had our people been more resilient. And he means more resilient economically. It is easy to see how such a deadly virus and the draconian measures required to contain it might spark an economic depression, but look straight into the eyes of the elephant in the room, and it is impossible to deny the many ways in which our extreme inequality, an exceptionally American affliction, has made the virus more deadly and its economic consequences more dire than in any other advanced nation. Why is our death toll so high and our unemployment rate so staggeringly off the charts? Why was our nation so unprepared and our economy so fragile? Why have we lacked the stamina and the will to contain the virus like most other advanced nations? The reason is staring us in the face. A stampede of rising inequality that has been trampling the lives and livelihoods of the vast majority of Americans year after year after year. Of course, America's chronic case of extreme inequality is old news. Many other studies have documented this trend, chronicled its impact, and analyzed its causes, but where others have painted the picture in terms of aggregate shares of GDP, productivity growth, or other cold hard statistics, the Rand report brings the inequality price tag directly home by denominating it in dollars. Not just the aggregate $50 trillion figure, but in granular demographic detail. For example, are you a typical black man earning $35,000 a year? You are being paid at least $26,000 a year less than you would have had income distributions held constant. Are you a college-educated, prime-aged, full-time worker earning $72,000 a year? Depending on the inflation index used, rising inequality is costing you between $48,000 and $63,000 a year. But whatever your race, gender, educational attainment, urbanicity, or income, the data show if you earn below the 90th percentile, the relentlessly upward redistribution of income since 1975 is coming out of your pocket. As Price and Edwards explain, from 1947 through 1974, real incomes grew close to the rate of per capita economic growth across all income levels. That means that for 3 decades, those at the bottom and middle of the distribution saw their incomes grow at about the same rate as those at the top. This was the era in which America built the world's largest and most prosperous middle class, an era in which inequality between income groups steadily shrank, even as shocking inequalities between the sexes and races largely remained. But around 1975, this extraordinary era of broadly shared prosperity came to an end. Since then, the wealthiest Americans, particularly those in the top 1% and top 0.1%, have managed to capture an ever larger share of our nation's economic growth. In fact, almost all of it. their real income skyrocketing as the vast majority of Americans saw little, if any, gains. On average, extreme inequality is costing the median income full-time worker about $42,000 a year. Adjusted for inflation using the CPI, the numbers are even worse. Half of all full-time workers, those at or below the median income of $50,000 a year, now earn less than half what they would have had incomes across the distribution continued to keep pace with economic growth. And that's per worker, not per household. At both the 25th and 50th percentiles, households comprised of a married couple with one full-time worker earned thousands of dollars less in 2018 dollars than a comparable household in 1975, and $50,000 and $66,000 less, respectively, than if inequality had held constant. A predicament compounded by the rising costs of maintaining a dignified middle-class life. According to Orrin Cass, executive director of the conservative think tank American Compass, the median male worker needed 30 weeks of income in 1985 to pay for housing, healthcare, transportation, and education for his family. By 2018, that cost of thriving index had increased from 30 weeks of income in 1985 to 53 weeks, more weeks than in an actual year. But the counterfactual reveals an even starker picture. In 2018, the combined income of married households with two full-time workers was barely more than what the income of a single-earner household would have earned had inequality held constant. Two-income families are now working twice the hours to maintain a shrinking share of the pie while struggling to pay housing, healthcare, education, childcare, and transportation costs that have grown at 2 to 3 times the rate of inflation. This dramatic redistribution of income from the majority of workers to those at the very top is so complete that even at the 95th percentile, most workers are still earning less than they would have had inequality held constant. It is only at the 99th percentile that we see incomes growing faster than economic growth, at 171% of the rate of per capita GDP. But even this understates the disparity. The average income growth for the top 1% was substantially higher, write Price and Edwards, at more than 300% of the real per capita GDP rate. The higher your income, the larger your percentage gains. As a result, the top 1%'s share of total taxable income has more than doubled, from 9% in 1975 to 22% in 2018, while the bottom 90% have seen their income share fall from 67% to 50%. This represents a direct transfer of income and, over time, wealth from the vast majority of working Americans to a handful at the very top. But given the changing demographic composition of the U.S. workforce, these top-line numbers can only tell part of the story. The U.S. workforce is now better educated and more urban than it was in 1975. It is also far less white and male, with white men falling from over 60% of the prime-aged workforce in 1974 to less than 45% by 2018. These changes are important because while there was far more equality between the income distributions in 1975, there was also more inequality within them, notably in regard to gender and race. For example, in 1975, the median income of white women was only 31% of that of white men. By 2018, white women were earning 68% as much. Likewise, the median income of black men as a share of their white counterparts' earnings rose from 74% in 1975 to 80% in 2018. Clearly, income disparities between races, and especially between men and women, have narrowed since 1975, and that is a good thing. But unfortunately, much of the narrowing we see is more an artifact of 4 decades of flat or declining wages for low and middle income white men than it is of substantial gains for women and non-whites. Much has been made about white male grievance in the age of Trump, and given their falling or stagnant real incomes, one can understand why some white men might feel aggrieved. White, non-urban, non-college educated men have the slowest wage growth in every demographic category. But to blame their woes on competition from women or minorities would be to completely miss the target. In fact, white men still earn more than white women at all income distributions, and substantially more than most non-white men and women. Only Asian American men earn higher. Yet there is no moral or practical justification for the persistence of any income disparity based on race or gender. The counterfactuals in the table above appear vastly unequal because they extrapolate from the indefensible 1975 levels of race and gender inequality. They assume that inequality remained constant both between income distributions and within them, that women and non-whites had not narrowed the income gap with white men. But surely this cannot be our goal. In an economy freed from race and gender bias and that shares the fruits of growth broadly across all income distributions, the most appropriate counterfactual for all the groups in this table would be the aggregate counterfactual for all groups. A median income of $57,000 a year for all adults with positive earnings, $92,000 for full-time prime-age workers. That would be the income for all workers at the 50th percentile, regardless of race or gender, had race and gender inequality within distributions been eliminated and inequality between distributions not grown. By this measure, we can see that in real dollars, women and non-whites have actually lost more income to rising inequality than white men, because starting from their disadvantaged positions in 1975, they had far more to potentially gain. Per capita GDP grew by 118% over the following 4 decades, so there was plenty of new income to spread around. That the majority of white men have benefited from almost none of this growth isn't because they have lost income to women or minorities, it's because they've lost it to their largely white male counterparts in the top 1% who have captured nearly all of the income growth for themselves. That's who the white men need to blame, guys. You need to blame the other white men at the top of the pile. According to French economist Thomas Piketty, men accounted for 85% of the top income centile in the mid-2010s, and while he doesn't specify, these men are overwhelmingly white. Thus, by far, the single largest driver of rising inequality these past 40 years has been the dramatic rise in inequality between white men. So white men, listen up. You need to blame the white assholes, the white male assholes at the top of the pile, and stop blaming women and minorities for your loss of market share. The data on income distribution by educational attainment are equally revealing in that they call the lie on the notion of a skills gap, a dominant narrative that has argued that rising inequality is largely a consequence of a majority of American workers failing to acquire the higher skills necessary to compete in our modern global economy. If workers were better educated, this narrative argues, they would earn more money. Problem solved. Indeed, at every income distribution, the education premium has increased since 1975, with the income of college graduates rising faster than their less educated counterparts. But this growing gap is more a consequence of falling incomes for workers without a college degree than it is of rising real incomes for most workers with one. For not only have workers without a degree secured none of the gains from 4 decades of economic growth, below the 50th percentile, they've actually seen their real incomes decline. College-educated workers are doing better. The median real income for full-time workers with a 4-year degree has grown from $50,000 a year in 1975 to $72,000 in 2018, but that still falls short of the $120,000 they'd be earning had incomes grown with per capita GDP. Even at the 90th percentile, a college-educated full-time worker making $191,000 a year is earning less than 78% what they would have had inequality held constant. The reality is that American workers have never been more highly educated. In 1975, only 67% of the adult U.S. workforce had a high school education or better, while just 15% had earned a 4-year college degree. By 2018, 91% of adult workers had completed high school, while the percentage of college graduates in the workforce had more than doubled to 34%. In raw numbers, the population of adult workers with a high school education or less has fallen since 1975, while the number of workers with a 4-year degree has more than quadrupled. It is impossible to argue that a skills gap is responsible for rising income inequality when the rate of educational attainment is rising faster than the rate of growth in productivity or per capita GDP. Yes, workers with college degrees are doing better than those without. The economy we've built over the past 45 years has been more unequal to some than to others. But below the 90th percentile, even college graduates are falling victim to a decades-long trend of radical inequality that is robbing them of most of the benefits of economic growth. The iron rule of market economies is that we all do better when we all do better. When workers have more money, businesses have more customers and hire more workers. 70% of our economy is dependent on consumer spending. The faster and broader real incomes grow, the stronger the demand for the products and services American businesses produce. This is the virtuous cycle through which workers and businesses prospered together in the decades immediately following World War II. But as wages stagnated after 1975, so too did consumer demand. And as demand slowed, so did the economy. A 2014 report from the OECD estimated that rising income inequality knocked as much as 9 points off U.S. GDP growth over the previous 2 decades, a deficit that has surely grown over the past 6 years as inequality has continued to climb. That's about $2 trillion worth of GDP that's being frittered away year after year through policy choices that intentionally constrain the earning power of American workers. COVID-19 may have triggered our current crisis, but it wasn't its only cause. For even had our political leaders done everything right in the moment, our response to the pandemic would still have been mired in the footprint of extreme inequality. A $50 trillion upward redistribution of wealth and income, $297,000 per household, that has left our families, our economy, and our democracy far less capable of fighting this virus than in other advanced nations. This is the America that stumbled into the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic catastrophe it unleashed. An America with an economy $2 trillion smaller and a workforce $2.5 trillion a year poorer than they otherwise would have been had inequality held constant since 1975. This is an America in which 47% of renters are cost-burdened, in which 40% of households can't cover a $400 emergency expense, in which half of Americans over age 55 have no retirement savings at all. This is an America in which 28 million have no health insurance and in which 44 million underinsured Americans can't afford the deductibles or copays to use the insurance they have. This is an America that recklessly rushed to reopen its economy in the midst of a deadly pandemic because businesses were too fragile to survive an extended closure and workers too powerless and impoverished to defy the call back to work. So no, we can't blame it all on Trump. We can blame it all on neoliberalism though, and Biden is one of the key architects of neoliberalism. So yes, it's fairer to blame all of this mess on Biden than on Trump. And don't call me a Trump supporter. Trump is an asshole, but he's a bungling imbecile. He's not the architect of all of this mess. Back to the story. There are some who blame the current plight of working Americans on structural changes in the underlying economy, on automation, and especially on globalization. According to this popular narrative, the lower wages of the past 40 years were the unfortunate but necessary price of keeping American businesses competitive in an increasingly cutthroat global market. But in fact, the $50 trillion transfer of wealth the Rand Report documents has occurred entirely within the American economy, not between it and its trading partners. No, this upward redistribution of income, wealth, and power wasn't inevitable. It was a choice, a direct result of the trickle-down policies we chose to implement since 1975. We chose to cut taxes on billionaires and to deregulate the financial industry. We chose to allow CEOs to manipulate share prices through stock buybacks and to lavishly reward themselves with the proceeds. We chose to permit giant corporations through mergers and acquisitions to accumulate the vast monopoly power necessary to dictate both prices charged and wages paid. We chose to erode the minimum wage and the overtime threshold and the bargaining power of labor. For 4 decades, we chose to elect political leaders who put the material interests of the rich and powerful above those of the American people. Other nations are suffering less from COVID-19 because they made better choices. And the good news is that America can too. Economics is a choice. We could choose to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 or $20 an hour and peg it to productivity growth like in the decades before 1975. We could choose to revalue work so that the majority of Americans once again earned time and a half pay for every hour worked over 40 hours a week. We could choose to provide affordable, high-quality health care, child care, and education to all Americans while modernizing our social insurance and retirement system so that contract and gig workers aren't left out and left behind. We could choose to make it easier for workers to organize and to defend the rights and interests of those who can't. We could choose to build a more equitable, resilient, and prosperous America, an America that grows its economy by intentionally including every American in it. But given our nation's radical redistribution of wealth and power these past 40 years, it won't be easy. What American workers need are multiple simultaneous experiments in rebuilding worker power, from tweaking existing labor laws to sectoral bargaining to the creation of whole new trade associations and broad-based not-for-profit organizations. For example, imagine an AARP for all working Americans, relentlessly dedicated to both raising wages and reducing the cost of thriving. A mass membership organization so large and so powerful that our political leaders won't dare to look the other way. This is me talking. I've been thinking that Consumer Reports, which used to be part of Consumers Union, which I think was started by Ralph Nader, I think that also would be a good organization to expand and include every working American. Only then, by matching power with power, can we clear a path to enacting the laws and policies necessary to ensure that trickle-down economics never threatens our health, safety, and welfare again. There is little evidence that the current administration has any interest in dealing with this crisis. Our hope is that a Biden administration would be historically bold. Yeah, you're going to hope for a long time. But make no mistake that both our political and economic systems will collapse absent solutions that scale to the enormous size of the problem. The central goal of our nation's economic policy must be nothing less than the doubling of median income. We must dramatically narrow inequality between distributions while eliminating racial and gender inequalities within them. This is the standard to which we should hold leaders from both parties. To advocate for anything less would be cowardly or dishonest or both. So, dear viewers and listeners, that's why we all need to make an unbreakable vow. Absolutely non-negotiable. Comfy complacency is why we have neoliberalism. That's why we need to make sure that none of our friends and neighbors or Facebook friends think it's okay to vote for Joe Biden or for the cabal that funds him. The powerful people on Wall Street who pull Joe's strings and Kamala's strings, Wall Street loves Kamala, we have to make sure that we never endorse them with our votes. How can we simultaneously protest in the streets against the plutocrats and yet vote for their cronies? Yes, voting still matters, if only symbolically. Until we change our voting habits, I don't see how we are going to get anybody who's on the comfortable side of the median income to come and protest with us. They have been duped into believing by corporate narrative managers that our enemies are really our friends. They want us to think that the Democrats are the good guys, and Fox News wants us to think that the Republicans are the good guys. And none of them are good guys. How do we protest until we know who the bad guys are? This is way more important, people, than almost any other lefty commentator seems to think it is. I don't even have 1,000 subscribers. And if I'm the only one saying that it's absolutely unconscionable to vote for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, then the job isn't going to get done. I do want to include Fiorella Isabel and Richard Medhurst. I think they're also saying that it's unconscionable to vote for Biden. So there are a couple of people, at least, with louder voices than mine who are saying this. But we need lots more. And this fight will come down to information. We won't get people out into the streets until they are informed about why they should be out in the streets. Against all odds, we have to spread this word somehow.